Hi, I'm Robin Ray with Crossville, and we're going to be talking Tech Talk this afternoon, and we're already having way too much fun with this topic. I am here today with Dan Lambert, president of Lambert Tile and Stone in Colorado, and David Gillespie, our technical services manager at Crossville. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today while we talk about, we have some lovely tile that Crossville has been bringing to the market, but the really critical point is when a designer begins a conversation with professional installers so they can start to bring the vision that a designer has to life. And there's so much technical expertise that goes into that part of the process. So that's why I'm so happy that you guys are going to be talking about this with me today. So let's go into when we talk about working with large porcelain panels, it's a completely different way of thinking than it is working with traditional tile.
Absolutely.
But you guys have really seen the market grow from its infancy to where it is today. So Dan, can you talk a little bit about what your exposure to porcelain panels has been and what the evolution's been like for your company?
Myself, personally, I've been working with the material for a while. Through the NTCA, I've been able to be aware of the inception of the material into the marketplace, work from a standards-based approach, and that's been my original experience into it. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've definitely seen it grow exponentially. It's new technology that is absolutely here to stay for a multitude of reasons. The technology, as far as the tooling, has come a long way since I first have seen it, and it's absolutely a technology it's not going to go anywhere. So I think that it's just going to be a matter of time that people are going to need to embrace it and see all the multitude of use that it has and how it can help our industry grow.
Well, that's excellent that you bring that level of experience into working with these materials. David, that's a really critical part of working with a material and having successful projects is having a lot of information in your back pocket to know how to overcome really important challenges that may come along when you're doing an installation. So help us understand what are some important things for everyone to be aware of when working with panels.
Well, I think coming out of the gate, it's a knowledge of tile itself, knowing where it started originally. The techniques to install regular dust press tile is a great background for any installer. This is kind of I would say, an advanced above that installation method where we took basic fundamentals in the standard of installing regular dust press material, 12 by 12s, 12 by 24s and beyond, and we adapted a technique because we were trying to make sure that these guys like Dan out in the field had a reliable, proven method of installation. So Crossville, very fortunately, pursued that. It's beautiful stuff, but if you have projects that can have snafus or something like that, it can be detrimental to the category, and we didn't want to see that. So giving guys like Dan the opportunity to have something documented and proven as an installation method was our focus from the very beginning with these materials. Through the tile industries and partners, thin set manufacturers, tool manufacturers, all converging together to tackle some of the challenges of dealing with these large gauge porcelain panels. And it was really, as an industry, a great opportunity to see the convergence and problem solving that each one of those entities brought to the table.
Yes.
So.
Well, when you talk about specifically, panels have allowed us to go places that traditional tile wouldn't let us go. But there are a lot of important tools, like you mentioned, that you need to have in order to pull off a really great execution. What do you feel like are some of those, from both of you, what are some of the tools that you feel like are just critical to have?
Having the right material to work with the tile is critical. The handling material is essential to minimize breakage, and having the training to use the tooling is critical to avoid costly mistakes. You're dealing with tiles that are up to 50 square feet per piece now, so to break one tile is catastrophic a lot of times. And
It'll
then
definitely
the
put a
shipping-
kink in your project.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the score and snap tools that manufacturers have created for this product make it exceptionally easy to work with the material, and you can essentially take a 5-foot by 10-foot piece of tile and cut it into whatever size you need, and so the design opportunities are virtually limitless with it. So yeah, the tooling is essential for to use the product and to incorporate it into the spaces. So without that, yeah, you kind of stuck.
That's completely understandable. So you mentioned the size of these panels being really, they're so enormous, but so you can get this really flawless look, fewer grout lines, so you're not dealing with as much risk in terms of bacteria, et cetera, the water penetration related to grout. But you don't have to use whole panels, right? So let's talk a bit about how thinking about panels and planning a panel project is different than traditional tile. David, can you talk about that a bit?
I think it's a great topic, to be honest with you, because there are some components that need to come together. The intent of the design. What does the designer's look? What does she really want? And then when you go through the process of, what are the capabilities of that material? And then let's put the other part of the equation in, the contractor's capabilities. To be able to develop a relationship between the tile contractor and the designer to relay those kind of considerations that may alter even a layout. We were talking about this earlier about, just because the tile comes in the big size doesn't necessarily mean it has to be applied that way. The characteristics of the tile itself, the ease of workmanship as far as cutting and manipulating it into different sizes, and even layouts. I think the layout, and Dan will agree to this, is always the most important aspect of a good tile job. So the considerations to the design with the layout and maximizing the use of the material comes from the expert of the applier, the installer, back to the designer. So it's a neat kind of time in our industry to see, the learning curves in both the labor aspect and the design aspect. So, and those are merging together very rapidly, and we're seeing some fantastic things out in the field.
And I think the relationship between the designer and the installer is one of the most important parts of the project, and talking through the design to ensure that it is achievable and it's going to look flawless when it's finished. So we talked about planning your project using panels and thinking about how that actually is a bit different and making the most of the material when you're working with panels. So this is a graphic that's meant to help us just talk through that, navigate it a little bit. David, walk us through this, will you?
Well, in looking at the layout of the pink section where the grid is laid out in the full panels, you're first trying to maximize the use of the panels. And then from another aspect, Dan might be looking at this of what is the most difficult aspect of the install, the cuts. And if you look at that center window area where we have those two C-shaped pieces, that may indicate to Dan that maybe this layout isn't the best as far as a workmanship. And maybe by altering where the grout joint layout is, and again, it's the edge of the tiles, the way they're cut, and they're almost identical to factory edge tiles. It allows him to make these kind of adjustments in the layout, especially when you're dealing with a 2 millimeter grout joint that becomes kind of negligible at that point, but it allows him the opportunity to have a better install and help prevent any kind of stresses in the tile or environmental things, deflection that might be in some certain instances in a corner of a cut that he knows from experience and can eliminate that.
And you're really protecting a project by bringing that level of experience and exposure and knowing about, we talked about temperature dynamics also being a factor in how the tile will perform in those environments over the long haul.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
So this is just a more of a real life image where we're starting to think about operating on the grid, not operating on the same grid that we would operate on in traditional tile. And then, like you also said, getting those grout lines so much smaller. And then also an important detail in the case of Crossville porcelain panels is that you're working in millimeters. And so thinking about that as well, and then your overall coverage is going to be a factor too.
I mean, the panels come in metric measurements, and our tooling in our factory to cut them down, if we want to use a custom cut, we need those measurements in metric. It helps with our guys on the line. But again, yeah, we want to maximize the use of the panels, minimize waste, and that also is reflected in the way the layout of this is, where we have vertical applications that are using the 39 3/8 width, but across the horizontal, we're using the length of the tile. So that's, again, back to the expert, the guy doing the takeoff like Dan, who's trying to say, okay, how many panels am I going to use if I lay out this way versus that way? And then getting back with the designer and reflecting those kind of adjustments to say, are you okay with these modifications? Because we're so used to typical tile being on a grid all the time. Well, these panels kind of change that mindset.
It seems that panels are changing our mindsets about so many things. We were talking before about how really panels and wall tile is really replacing wallpaper in a lot of applications, where if you're going to invest so much time and energy in a beautiful feature wall, you want it to have it's going to last for generations ultimately. And it's nice to see us make that level of shift in the market while protecting the integrity of the installations. So some of the other elements that we've talked about that are important are thinking about when the material is getting to the job site. So what are some other preparation points that are really critical?
Having a pre-plan meeting with your team and with, say, the director of engineering if you're on a larger project is critical. You know, the pieces are bigger. They're not tempered. So if you break them, they are large shards of glass, you know, basically. Handling is critical. So you want to make sure that you have a clear path, that everybody's talked through the process of how you're going to stage the job, where the material is going to be cut and worked with. We have a job coming up this coming week where we're going to be using a crane to fly the material up to where we're going to be working on it. And it's kind of the coordination of all these steps to ensure that there's not going to be unnecessary damage to the material or to surrounding areas or to people while you're even just staging the material. So it's critical.
I'd like to comment on that. I think it's important to point out that it's actually changing when the tile contractor is getting to the job site in some instances. When you think about doing a kitchen floor, it would be much easier in these large porcelain panels to put the tile in before the cabinets. So getting the general contractors or the builders used to that shift in the sequence of assembly for the project, that's important. And like Dan said, you know, the pre-planning, it's a big piece of tile. We joke in our classes about the new box of tile being 11 feet long by 4 feet wide. So that changes the whole logistical equation in itself.
Wonderful. I love that. So we're talking about, hey, this is a new way of thinking. When you think about actually determining the number of panels that you need to complete a job, how do you recommend that you approach that?
Well, I think the bigger question is the relationship between the square footage number and the panel number. That's kind of where the expert, again, like in Dan's case, can look at that project, and what you're trying to do, again, is maximize the use of the panel in its entirety, and you basically count tiles. And that may go back to the designer to say, you know, this layout, we use this amount of panels, this other alternative, we can minimize that because these extra pieces can be used over there. And also patterns on the tile may also change the whole layout, because turning a tile 90 degrees, if it's directional, isn't conducive with the look that the designer's trying to get. So those things are critical. The better contractors understand that. It's a slow curve to get them to not order square footage but order panels, but it's getting there.
Right, so you're talking about the entire area of a panel and maximizing the use of it versus the old way where we would just think in square feet. That makes sense.
And take a certain percentage. There was usually formulas that Dan would calculate in for overages based on a pattern or size tile. But as these panels are getting bigger, for instance, the real quick one would be, a 10-foot tile and an 8-foot wall. You're already at 20% overage, in square footage waste. So those things have to be reconsidered when doing takeoffs.
So what you're telling me is that Dan is able to do some math, and that's really important to your project.
And plan ahead.
And plan ahead. You mentioned direction is also something that needs to be communicated with. If a designer is using the pattern in the tile to influence the design that you're actually installing, then you guys have to have a conversation about what is the direction of the actual pattern or the graphic in the tile. So are designers really thoughtful about communicating that, or is more information always better? How would you like them to work with you?
I'd say that more communication is better. A lot of times in the pre-construction meetings with the design team is where we can resolve a lot of what could become an issue. And it's, in my experience, it hasn't been an issue because we do bring up all these questions ahead of time. One of the things that happens fairly often with us is when we have book match pieces. You're going to have X amount of book match pieces, and if they're going to be used in the same space, you may want to cut them at different heights and turn them upside down in other areas and do different things to be creative with the material as well.
I love it. I mean, I can't imagine having to step back from the project and see the pattern in that way, where I'm going to match this veining around this column, but it really is a big difference maker when you have someone who's worked a lot with the material and is very knowledgeable about those pieces and parts. When you see someone do it at that level, you can really tell a difference. And so it's a great testament to the work that you do.
I think it's important also to point out the evolution of how this is all going. In the very beginning, there was a lot of fear about handling these big pieces of porcelain. What we're seeing now is, there's a rush to learn how to do it because it is a momentum it's gaining every day. Every year, we're increasing the square footage of sales, but the enthusiasm is there, and the commitment of tile installers is also getting there. We do classes in Crossville that pretty much stay booked up all the time. And we're reaching out through our thin set manufacturers to continue that educational process. And it's a great thing. I've been stopped by a lot of people that have been to our trainings, thanking us for, the work that we've done and the success they're having out in the field. So that's what makes it worthwhile.
Well, David, I know that your team at Crossville, you guys have really worked hard to elevate panels in the market so that I keep using the word integrity, but it's really critical when we talk about not only our business and our training, but the product too. And I'm personally proud of how we have worked to get that information out into the market because we knew it needed to be supported at a great level all the way through the process, including the installers. And I really feel that we've started to see the payback of that in the market as it's continued to mature. So another great thing about Crossville is how much we've put into training. So we have over 1,000 people that we trained in.
We're approaching 2,000.
We're approaching 2,000. Excellent. But the competency that comes from that and a comfort level for the installers is just huge. So do you think after working with panels for a while, do you find it almost easier than traditional tile, or is it about the same, or does it depend?
I'd say it really depends on the specific project. Projects can vary just like a regular ceramic or porcelain tile job can, and gauge porcelain tile panels are no different in that regard. There's some projects that are very cut up, doing a lot of miters, waterfall edges and things like that. And people trying to incorporate undermount sinks and things that can really take a lot of time, a lot of labor goes into that. So I would say that it's more labor intensive overall with the larger panels, but yes, the more you work with it, you will get more proficient with the material. But it is not like a traditional tile job where you're installing this on your own. You need a team to install the material. And that's probably the biggest difference with it, aside from the sheer size and everything else. It's the amount of manpower that you need to properly perform the job. A lot of the mortars, they're sensitive to being open for too long. So as far as spreading the panels, spreading the substrate, applying the tile, everything needs to happen within a certain time frame. So that can add to that labor cost as well.
But on top of that, Robin, the designs have been getting more complex as well. I think it kind of runs parallel that, the more familiar that everybody gets with the material, they start thinking of bigger and better things to do with it. So, as these guys are getting more expertise in what they're doing, the designers are also getting more comfortable with doing those kind of off-the-charts kind of designs. So it kind of goes in both directions as far as, the intensity of how this stuff is being used. So.
Well, and that is what makes it so exciting to be at this stage where everyone is creating new things together. To help us understand, how would you advise someone in finding the right installer for porcelain panels? What are some important things to consider?
Well, I would vet the people, ask for a, list of references, look at work that they've completed with the materials before, ask for any certifications and background in the knowledge of the installation company, and I would be skeptical of I guess having a sole proprietor type person install it. As I mentioned earlier, it takes a team to install this material and do it in the proper time frame, and that's a big part of it.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. So when you're thinking about choosing your installer and you want to see work that they have already produced, is that something that you feel like you should be comfortable asking for examples that have already been completed? And if they're really competent, they should be able to produce those, right?
Well, in the industry, too, we've also passed a standard that is basically ANSI 108.19, which is the criteria for installing these gauge porcelain panels. That was an important step in the industry to get established so guys like Dan had a reliable method that was proven to work at their back. It kind of weeds out the guys that understand the importance of following industry standards and methods. It also, the commitment in that standard of qualified labor is also spelled out. The commitment also from, investing in the tools required. If you don't have the proper tools like suction cup frames and rail cutters, you're not going to be able to manipulate the pieces the way they can be manipulated to fit into a project. So that all that has to come together. So I do suggest that the owners or the project, people ask those questions of their subcontractor about, do you have the tools? How many projects under your belt? Do you have a portfolio? That's all, are you trained? All those things need to line up. It's a little different story replacing a 12 by 12 versus a 39 3/8 by 118 and 8 piece of tile. So.
Well, this has been super helpful, gentlemen. I appreciate all of this great feedback and all of these great points for people to think about as they're working with panels and making choices about designing with panels. So thank you guys for the excellent work that you've been doing and for sharing your expertise with us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.